Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Thursday, April 3rd, day 545 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military reporter, Emmanuel Fabian. Hi, Manny. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. Good morning.
Good morning. We are going to address recent developments in Syria, in Lebanon, and in the Gaza Strip. We'll hear about Manny's trip into Lebanon yesterday with Defense Minister Israel Katz and what Katz told him there. And we'll also discuss accusations from the United Nations that Israel killed 15 medics in Gaza and buried them in a mass grave. All this and more when we're back. The provincial government in southern Syria's Daraa said that 9 citizens were killed and several were injured in Israeli bombardments last night following an Israeli ground incursion. Soldiers were also operating on the ground in what is possibly the deepest incursion into Syria to date. So, Manny, what is the goal of the current operations, both from the air and apparently from the ground?
So we saw quite a few incidents overnight and last night in Syria. There was first, of course, these airstrikes that were carried out in Syria. They targeted 2 major air bases, one in Hama, which is in sort of central western Syria, and one called the T4 air base. It's more in the center of the country. And there was also a strike outside Damascus. The army says that these strikes are aimed at taking away what they call remaining military capabilities, so things that Israel sees as a potential threat to the country. Regarding the air bases, it's worth noting that Israel fears or has identified, or there's been all sorts of reports that Turkey is very interested in helping the new Syrian government to establish military infrastructure. There's been reports that Turkey wants to take over the T4 base and use it to train the new Syrian army. Israel doesn't want the new Syrian government to have a major force that could be a threat to Israel. So that's regarding the strikes. And then the ground operations is similar as well. Israel doesn't want the South Syria area, the area close to Israel's border, to have any weapons in it. It wants to demilitarize that area. Defense Minister Katz has talked about areas that reach up to 15 kilometers from the border where it would be completely demilitarized. And there's another up to 80 kilometers, which is sort of an area of influence. Troops wouldn't be operating there, but it's an area that Israel also seeks to demilitarize. So the operation we saw sort of overnight, troops pushed into the town of Tasil. It's between 10 and 13 kilometers-ish from the border, well outside the buffer zone, of course, where Israel deployed troops to. It may mark the deepest, or at least it's one of the deepest operations that I've seen reported to date since Israel entered the buffer zone in December. And those operations are aimed at basically collecting weapons that could pose a threat to Israel, that could fall into the hands of what Israel calls hostile forces, which mainly refers to any of the local jihadi groups there that are against Israel and want to attack Israel, and also Palestinian terror groups, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who are attempting to gain a foothold in Syria and then use Syria as a sort of a launching pad to attack Israel. That operation, no Israeli soldiers were wounded, but the army reported that troops came under fire, and the troops returned fire, killing several of these gunmen. Also airstrikes were carried out there against these gunmen during this operation. And it's only the second time that, since December, that troops have come under fire while operating in southern Syria.
What kind of gunmen are these that are shooting against the IDF troops? Meaning, is it part of the government, the newly officially sworn-in government, or is it some kind of other rebel group?
So Israel doesn't actually know to say, both in this case and the previous case, who exactly they are. The sort of assessment is that it's members of sort of local clans and local groups that maybe somewhat affiliated with the new government, somewhat not. South Syria is a bit of a chaotic area. It's less organized than other areas of Syria. Even when the Syrian rebels overtook the Assad regime and brought it down, the forces of Ahmad al-Shara, or known as al-Jolani, he came from the north and pushed into Damascus. And there was a sort of a local uprising in the south. His forces didn't ever push into the south of Syria near Israel's border. So there's all sorts of sort of a mix of various groups. Some are more affiliated with ISIS and more extremist jihadist groups, and others are less so. There's also Druze forces there. It's quite a mess in that area. So Israel doesn't really know who exactly opened fire, but the assessment is that it's probably a local group that was trying to confront the IDF there. Of course, the IDF is pushing into Syria and trying to raid a town there to try and find weapons.
And so because of this lawlessness and this potential balagan, Israel is just acting at will, it sounds like at this point. There was no specific trigger, perhaps some intelligence that there were weapons there, and Israel is just entering Syria whenever at this point. Is that correct?
There is intelligence. I mean, the army knows where it's going to go and collect weapons. There is intelligence there. There's also somewhat cooperation with some of the local towns and villages. We've seen in areas closest to the border, especially the Druze towns, the sides are speaking to each other. The army is speaking to local officials in these Druze villages. They're coordinating, they're cooperating there, and there isn't as much friction there. But this is a town much deeper into Syria, and that was indeed a friction overnight where the government opened fire on the army trying to reach the area.
I just think a couple of years ago, this situation would have been unthinkable. So let's turn to Gaza, where yesterday Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that advancing IDF forces were carving out a new security corridor across southern Gaza, which would likely cut off the city of Rafah from the rest of the Strip, as Israel, of course, is seeking to pile on pressure on Hamas to free the hostages. So Israel is, quote unquote, shifting gears in Gaza and creating a second Philadelphia route, Netanyahu said yesterday in a video message. So it's called the Morag Corridor, and it was named after an Israeli settlement that was around in that area until the entire Israeli population was evacuated from the Gaza Strip in 2005 in the disengagement. So, Manny, first of all, let's talk about the importance or potential importance of the location of this Morag corridor.
So there's one of the main interesting things about this corridor. It's basically located between Rafah and Khan Yunis, and that is one of the few areas of Gaza that the IDF has not operated in at all during the war, during the ground offensive. At least there's been strikes from the air, but ground troops have not operated in that area. It's a relatively large area, and there's thought to be Hamas infrastructure there, rocket launchers, tunnels, etc. But in addition to this being an area that the army hasn't operated, it also encircles the entire city of Rafah. And if you kind of look at the map, it's sort of extending the Philadelphia corridor, which is around a kilometer from the Egypt border into Gaza. The army's pushed into Rafah, which is another kilometer, 2 kilometers. But to reach the so-called Morag corridor, it's way after Rafah. It's around 5 kilometers in. That would mean that Israel would be controlling just a huge section of southern Gaza, and it would the army is aiming to depopulate that area. It's already issued evacuation warnings to civilians to make them move to the Mawasi area on the coast. Israel says it's for their protection, so that they aren't harmed by the fighting. But this does seem to be, as we've seen Defense Minister Katz threaten, is to take territory from Gaza in an effort to pressure Hamas back into a hostage deal. And it's not just in the south that the army is doing this. Across the entire border with Gaza, the buffer zone that we knew once, it was 700 meters to a kilometer. Israel is now basically doubling that. It's much, much deeper into Gaza. Also on the north of the Strip, so the towns of Bet Hanun, Bet Lahia are all going to be entirely included, pretty much. Even edges of Jabalia are going to be entirely included within this buffer zone. And it's creating basically a smaller version of Gaza now for Palestinian civilians to be in. And this is all part of an effort to pressure Hamas back into a hostage deal. That's what Netanyahu has been saying. Even the IDF chief of staff and the Shin Bet head have said that the ultimate goal of this operation is to pressure Hamas back into a deal.
And we're seeing that the civilians themselves are rising up. And last week, there were several occasions of this. And then again, yesterday, after several days without massive protests inside the Gaza Strip. Yesterday, hundreds of Palestinians rallied in Beit Lahia, which I believe is one of the places that you mentioned is now going to be in this buffer zone, and that's in the northern Gaza Strip. And they're chanting, Hamas out, enough death, in these renewed protests. So residents are obviously angered by the new Israeli military evacuation orders. Nobody wants to go back to living in these camp cities on the coast. And the thing is, we're also seeing an uptick in rocket salvos from other areas, or lots of areas within the Gaza Strip. So it is a bit of a push-pull situation here. And how is the IDF now responding to these increased rockets coming from the Strip into Israel?
The response to the rockets is almost the same as it has been until now, which is when a rocket's fired, the army issues an evacuation order for the specific area where the rocket was launched from, and then the army carries out airstrikes in the area, targeting the launcher, targeting the operatives behind the attacks. It is interesting, again, that most of the recent rocket fires actually been Islamic Jihad, or at least Islamic Jihad have claimed to fire the rockets, and not Hamas. Hamas carried out several major attacks already. They fired towards central Israel, they fired also at the south, but the last few rocket attacks, mainly on Sderot and the border communities, have actually been Islamic Jihad. But the response is the same. It's evacuate and then carry out strikes there to remove any of the infrastructure.
Okay, what else is happening on the ground in Gaza right now? And if you can, I know it's somewhat classified, can you compare the number of troops that are on the ground now versus during the height of the fighting, which we saw about a year ago?
Right, so right now there are 3 IDF divisions in Gaza. It's not the same amount of troops, of course, as we saw during the height. There was much, much more. At the time, I think it reached even 5 divisions at one point. And even now, these 3 divisions, within the constraints of what I can detail, they're not complete divisions. So it's not a huge number of forces. But the military is saying, and defense officials are saying, that the current stage in this operation can be done with the amount of forces that they have. Meaning that they expect this stage in the offensive against Hamas, this renewed offensive, to go according to plan with the number of troops that they have. What could change is if there is, and there is expected to be additional sort of phases to this, with additional land being captured and different areas where the army is going into, then the army would likely need to deploy more forces to the area. Would that require the call up of reservists or a large amount of reservists? It's unclear exactly. The army's saying that it can manage, and we know there's been a sort of a big issue with reservists showing up to duty now because it's been a long war, and many of them have families and jobs that they need to attend to. So it's a bit of a problematic situation for the army now. If it does need to, if it's ordered by the defense minister or prime minister to push forward with some major stage in this operation, then it would likely need to call up much more forces. But as it stands right now, this current stage, 3 divisions, and that's what the army is saying is enough right now for this.
Okay, we're going to go to a short break and then discuss the allegations by the UN against the IDF. And we're back. 15 emergency aid workers from the Red Crescent, the United Nations, and the Hamas-linked Palestinian Civil Defense have been recovered from a grave in the sand in the south of the Gaza Strip, according to UN officials. UN aid chief Tom Fletcher said in a post on X that the bodies were buried near, quote, wrecked and well-marked vehicles, adding they were killed by Israeli forces while trying to save lives. We demand answers and justice. So the IDF on Friday acknowledged that it had fired on the ambulance and fire engines, saying it had identified them as, quote, suspicious vehicles. Now, Manny, of course, there have been many situations in which Hamas took over or Hamas operatives were part of a team inside vehicles such as ambulances and fire trucks. But I personally cannot recall an occasion in which the IDF would have buried the people after this kind of operation. It just sounds so bizarre. The allegations are crazy. So I mean, we're talking about, from The Guardian, for example, allegations that the IDF killed these members one by one and then buried them. I just can't wrap my mind around it. So please give me some enlightenment.
So, according to the army's sort of version of the events here, and I will add that it is still somewhat under investigation, on March 23, so Sunday, a week ago, troops operating in Rafah saw several vehicles approaching IDF troops. They were uncoordinated, so normally when civilian emergency vehicles want to go through the area, UN vehicles, ambulances, etc., then they need to coordinate with the army, and it's done all the time, especially in that area. But according to the army, they approached troops in a suspicious way. They didn't have their emergency signals on. They didn't have headlights on, and the army opened fire at these vehicles. And it has determined that the troops killed a prominent Hamas operative who participated in the October 7th onslaught, along with 8 other Hamas and Islamic Jihad members.
So that's out of the 15, 8 were confirmed?
No, so that's one incident.
Okay.
And then there were additional vehicles in the area, and the army also fired upon those. It was sort of a few events that took place in the same time. That's why I say it's still under investigation as to what exactly came first here. But the army is saying that it killed Hamas and Islamic Jihad members in that area at around the same time as well. And then there were additional vehicles who the IDF also identified as suspicious. They didn't know who they were. They had just killed Hamas members, at least according to this chain of events. And then they opened fire on them. And then it turned out afterwards that these vehicles were ambulances and fire trucks that we don't know exactly if they were heading to maybe recover the Hamas members who were killed or some other incident in the area. And the army is saying that it also coordinated the evacuation of the bodies of these medics who were killed there, allowing other medics to come in and recover them. The IDF hasn't commented on these allegations that they were discarded in a mass grave. According to the initial medical reports, they were in a sort of a shallow grave or in sand, covered in sand. So we don't exactly know if the army deliberately dug a grave and put all the bodies in this grave, or whether or not maybe troops in the area covered the bodies in sand, just a small layer of sand as well. But the army still hasn't commented on these allegations. What I do know is that in addition to this initial military investigation into what the troops were doing, it's also been sent to this top tier investigation body in the army. It's a sort of an independent body that looks into unusual incidents amid the war. We saw it in various cases, like when the army struck the World Central Kitchen convoy in Gaza many months ago. So this body is called the General Staff Fact-Finding Mechanism or something like that. They're investigating this incident now and will try and figure out what exactly happened here, whether or not troops deliberately buried these bodies. Maybe it was accidental, maybe a bulldozer was passing over the area afterwards. We don't exactly know, but it's definitely not a very good look for Israel, especially with the footage that we saw, seeing the bodies of these medics being recovered from under the sand, and they were all, or at least many of them were all in one area together. So it does appear that they were maybe deliberately put there. We're going to have to wait for more from the army.
Definitely, there's more to tell in this story, and we will tell it, right, Manny? We will follow up and tell it. Okay, now, yesterday you were in Lebanon at an IDF post on the edge of Markaba, which overlooks the Israeli border community of Margoliot. And it's one of these 5 strategic positions that the IDF has remained in since the February deadline to withdraw from the ceasefire that was brokered in November. Okay, that's a bit of a complicated situation there. Now, just to remind our listeners, of course, Hezbollah, the target of the IDF's operations, started firing rockets and missiles and drones at Israeli communities and military posts since October 8th, 2023, in solidarity with Hamas. So this ceasefire came about eventually after the IDF decimated Hezbollah, essentially, but decided to stay in these 5 specific locations in this de facto border buffer zone. And you were there with Defense Minister Israel Katz. So before we talk about what he said, could you please just set the scene for us? What is it like where you were?
I'll tell you what, it gives you a very good view of Margoliot, and it's I'm not joking. It's really makes sense why the army is there. So it's a hill inside Lebanon, just across from Margoliot, on the edge of the Lebanese village of Markaba. And if you think back a year ago when Hezbollah was there, and this was a village where Hezbollah was very entrenched in, it had tunnels there, it had weapon depots there and rockets, etc. Hezbollah could just look straight down the hill and fire directly at Margoliot, and they did that for many months. They were launching mortars and anti-tank missiles directly at civilian homes in Margoliot.
For months, Manny, just to stop you, but also for years, right? Because the IDF wasn't there and they could actually enter this location anytime they wanted. It was a constant threat. Yes. Yeah,
it's a constant, for sure. And it's understandable why Margoliot is still mostly empty of residents. They didn't want to return because of they left because of Hezbollah's daily attacks, and many have yet to return because they are, of course, worried about the Hezbollah threat. But this is one of 5, so the others are very similar. They overlook Israeli border towns where the army didn't have any answer to basically defend these areas. The idea behind it is that if Hezbollah or other terror groups try to carry out an attack on Israel from Lebanon, then the first thing they're going to see is the army and not civilians. Beforehand, they could have just straight away seen civilians and not encountered the army first. So that's the sort of logic behind this army post. And I asked Katz, how long will the army need to stay here in order to actually provide defenses? Because you can't stay in Lebanon forever. I mean, the Americans have allowed Israel to stay in these 5 positions, but it can't be forever. And he said that they'll stay there until the threat is removed and until the Lebanese army is able to enforce the ceasefire and basically remove all of the Hezbollah infrastructure in southern Lebanon, push Hezbollah back. Until then, the army will stay there. And I think that really tells us that the army is going to stay in these army posts indefinitely for at least the near future. There's no I don't think there's a way that Israel will leave these areas, because the civilians who live in these towns won't return to their homes. But during this visit that we had to this army post, the chairman of Margoliot, Eitan Davidi, actually joined. It's 100 meters from his house. It's just across the border. He joined as well, and he said that, looking down, he said, this gives us security. It's not just a sense of security, it's actual security. The army's here, looking over the town, preventing any Hezbollah members from approaching or launching attacks. And he called on his residents to return home because they can now, because the army is there to protect them. And this logic of having an army post in front of the communities doesn't just apply to these 5 posts. Along the entire Lebanon border, the army is establishing new posts in front of every community, those that didn't have a post yet next to them. So the army is, adding like 15 or 20 more army posts along the entire Lebanon border, just to increase not just the sense of security, but the actual physical security to these border communities who, for many, many years, just had no protection against attacks from Hezbollah.
So these new posts are obviously on the Israeli side of the border, right? These 15 new posts, whereas the 5 posts in this buffer zone are arguably really not.
Yeah, they're in Lebanon.
Right, they're in Lebanon. And obviously Israel was in Lebanon for 20 years. We have precedent of Israel staying in Lebanon, and nobody, I would assume, wants to go back to that. But the other question is, Manny, do we have enough forces for all these new posts that you're talking about? I mean, that's 20 new posts if you add in the buffer zone and the 15 new posts, and that's a lot of soldiers, isn't it?
It is. The army has, and we've published this previously, the army has tripled the number of forces it has on the Lebanon border compared to what it had before the war. And that's going to be the permanent deployment of troops there. Triple what was pre-October 7. Where do you get those troops from? It's a great question. Some of them are reserves, some of them are part of the standing army. And the army's repeatedly said that it needs more soldiers. It's desperate for more soldiers because of the current security challenges. It's not just the Lebanon border that needs more troops. Syria needs more troops now as well. Gaza, of course, with this new offensive, and we can't even forget what's happening in the West Bank as well. Constant operations there. Yeah, the army needs more troops. It's no secret at all.
No, it's not. And it's definitely another further conversation. So, Manny, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and edited on video by Thomas Gersh. Until tomorrow, shalom.